websites, and from 2017 to 2020 was a staff writer and senior investigative reporter for Mint Press News. She currently writes for The Last American Vagabond. Now, Whitney was in Europe, and now she's back in South America because of traveling problems and other reasons. We decided, or she decided, and we agreed with her that it was probably best to do a pre-recording. So she's going to be talking to us about the parallels of 2001 anthrax and COVID-19. Now, this young lady is, I think, one of the best researchers that you'll come across. So I'm looking forward to her presentation. I'm sure you are too.
Hello, I'm Whitney Webb, investigative researcher, writer, and soon-to-be author, formerly at Mint Press News and currently for my own site, Unlimited Hangout, where you can currently find all of my published work. In this talk today, I'm going to be focusing on some of the parallels between the anthrax attacks and COVID-19. Many of these parallels, though not all of them, I explored last year in depth in an investigative series entitled Engineering Contagion, as well as some follow-up articles that were published last year. Personally, I am of the opinion that September 11th, 2001 and the 2001 anthrax attacks were originally planned as part of the same operation, with 9/11 being the initial catalyst to introduce the war on terror, and the anthrax attacks apparently being meant to be the first of potentially several bioterror events that were meant to combine that with a war on bioterrorism. Both of these events, I would argue, were trial runs for major aspects of what we've been experiencing over the past year and a half with COVID-19. The original 9/11 anthrax roadmap appears to have been planned to be a series of perpetual fear-inducing events caused by an invisible enemy, with that invisible enemy being both terrorist and also pathogen. However, anthrax and the narrative around the anthrax attacks quickly fell apart when traced back to a U.S. military one was on religious extremism and terrorism as opposed to bioterrorism. However, within the national security state in the US after 9/11, bioterror focused initiatives were numerous and have several ties to what we have seen unfold over the past year and a half, despite not being so much in the public eye. With COVID-19, we have similarly had cycles of fear-inducing events following the initial declaration of a pandemic, with these fear-inducing events so far taking the form of variants. However, as I'll get into more at the end of this talk, much has been ceded by the mainstream narrative, public health bodies, and politicians, not just in the US, but around the world, that points towards some sort of imminent fusion of the prevailing COVID-19 narratives and bioterrorist narratives that have their roots in the 2001 anthrax attacks. Because 9/11 and anthrax were the initial blueprint for much of what has unfolded over the course of the COVID-19 crisis, there are many important parallels with the events of 2001 and COVID. In the case of parallels between the 2001 anthrax attacks and COVID-19, the first one I'll be talking about today are the predictive simulations that briefly preceded both events. So in the case of the 2001 anthrax attacks, there was a predictive simulation that took place a couple months before the anthrax attacks themselves occurred. This exercise is known as Dark Winter. It took place in late June 2001 at Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. The exercise itself, Dark Winter, the name for the exercise derives from a statement that's made by an individual named Robert Cadlick, who in some of the news clips, there were sort of these, as part of the simulation, were created, sort of a fictitious broadcaster was interviewing people or talking about various aspects of the exercise. One of the interviews she does is with Robert Cadlick, who in the course of that interview for this segment for the simulation says it could be a very dark winter for America. This is very important because Robert Cadlick, I wrote about him extensively last year. He was a veteran of he's a veteran of the George W. Bush administration after the anthrax attacks or after 9/11 specifically, became very intimately involved with what the Pentagon was doing. specifically in the realm of bioterrorism, which is very important because, in that period are the lead ups to the anthrax attacks following September 11th, 2001. But in the years since his role, in that particular period of time in 2001, was essentially the architect for the position he would later hold under Trump at HHS, the ASPR position, or Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. Robert Kadlec, through several iterations of legislation that he was involved in drafting, essentially created that very position that he came to occupy right as, COVID hit the scene. And because of the powers that he had imbued that office with, was in charge of leading HHS's entire COVID-19 response during the Trump administration. So there's just a couple of things I want to focus on about Dark Winter in the interest of time. If you're interested in more of that, in more detail about this particular exercise, I would refer you to the Engineering Contagion series. I think some of the most important things that came out of this, of course, were the predictive narratives that later come to be used or attempted to be used in the wake of the 2001 anthrax attacks. So during Dark Winter, there was the claim that Saddam Hussein of Iraq had recruited biowarfare specialists from the Soviet Union, was attempting to create biological weapons, and was also attempting to work with terrorist groups in Afghanistan in pursuit of those bioterror ambitions. Of course, there was no evidence for this, but later with the 2001 anthrax attacks, we see the same narrative emerge because of the difficulty in linking Saddam Hussein directly to 9/11. The anthrax attacks were meant to not only link Saddam Hussein to terrorist groups in the United States, but also link Saddam Hussein more closely with terror groups based in Afghanistan, specifically Al-Qaeda. So the last thing I want to emphasize about Dark Winter, which is particularly relevant since we're going to be moving now into Event 201 and Crimson Contagion, though I only have a brief amount of time to discuss those, is that Dark Winter focused very much on disinformation and misinformation, unverified claims, talks about unverified cures, and all of the and things of that nature, and so-called fake news and all of these things that later were also a major focus of the pre-COVID simulation. Moving along, probably the most well-known pre-COVID predictive simulation is Event 201 that, as I mentioned earlier, hosted by Thomas Inglesby of Dark Winter and hosted by the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, which was the main author and one of the main sponsors of Dark Winter itself. So Event 201 was predictive for many reasons, the least or the most well-known of which being the fact that it predicted, at the end of 2019, a novel zoonotic coronavirus. The other main predictive simulation we have was Crimson Contagion, that was designed and ran by Robert Kadlec's office at the Department of Health and Human Services in the US. In terms of narratives that were predictive, there is the fact that it was a pandemic influenza originating specifically in China. Essentially what happens is with people becoming ill in China first with a disease that they name H7N9, and that different tourists or individuals in China take flights around the world, and they have a non-severe acute respiratory illness, not unlike COVID-19. And then after they are on their return flights from China or are traveling out of China, they begin to experience the onset of this mysterious respiratory illness. And what's interesting about Crimson Contagion is that it has a specific emphasis on vaccines, which is very relevant when you look at Robert Kadlec's connections to a company we'll be talking about in a little bit called Emergent Biosolutions, previously known as Bioport, that was intimately involved with the anthrax attack situation because it was the sole producer of the anthrax vaccine in the United States. So a second key parallel we have between COVID-19 and anthrax is the presence of gain-of-function research with ties to the U.S. military, or specifically going on before each of these events took place. And you could argue that in the case of COVID-19, the extreme emphasis on there being a zoonotic origin, despite evidence to the contrary or competing theories of equal validity, those were sort of smushed down to obscure this gain-of-function connection and this commonality between the two events. So in the case of the anthrax attacks, what's often not covered regarding those attacks is that one particular facility located in West Jefferson, Ohio, Battelle Memorial Institute, was involved in gain-of-function research on anthrax. More than one project, by the way, one funded by the Pentagon and one funded by the CIA. One of the individuals working on that I mentioned earlier, William C. Patrick III, who worked closely with Stephen Hatfill, one of the original suspects of the FBI anthrax investigation. If you want more information about William C. Patrick III, who I think is a very interesting individual in these events, please refer to my series, specifically part 3. So William Patrick was involved with Ken Allebeck in these projects that were funded by the Pentagon and the CIA. Those projects were specifically using the AIM strain, which of course was the very strain used in the anthrax attacks, in which Battelle essentially controlled and was also involved in sending to other places that anthrax researchers think may have been the source of the anthrax used in the attacks, like Dugway Proving Ground in Utah. What's also important is the involvement of Battelle with a company called Bioport. I'll be talking about in just a second in more detail. But for now, Bioport, which is now known as Emergent Biosolutions, was the very troubled producer of the anthrax vaccine. They had a monopoly on that vaccine, very deep ties to the Pentagon. And the Pentagon, their anthrax vaccine program was in direct connection with the Pentagon because of the Pentagon's mandate for military personnel to have the Bioport anthrax vaccine. However, Bioport's anthrax vaccine was very troubled, having a lot of issues. There was talk about them being removed from the program entirely, and that plans for how to do that were supposed to come out in mid-September 2001. But of course, because of 9/11, that did not take place. But as a way to help rescue the Bioport vaccine program, there was an effort, or a contract was given by Bioport to Battelle. And you also had people from Battelle, again, with its close ties to U.S. intelligence and the U.S. military, being sent to Bioport factories, and they became rather symbiotic in the lead up to the 2001 anthrax attacks, which of course, once those attacks took place, all the concerns, questions, and other issues that Bioport's anthrax vaccine program was experiencing become completely replaced with fervent demands for more of its anthrax vaccine. Quite a convenient turn of events. So gain of function with COVID-19 has gotten a lot more coverage than it did in the case of the 2001 anthrax attacks, but there are some commonalities there. So for example, if you've followed the work of Sam Husseini, for example, whose work on this I definitely recommend very highly. EcoHealth Alliance, one of the main contractors involved in a lot of the shadier gain-of-function research that was taking place at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, has very close ties not just to U.S. aid, which a lot of people for a long time have regarded as essentially a front for the CIA, but also with the Pentagon, and significant amounts of its funding were derived from the military, and a lot of gain-of-function research around the world receives funding from the Pentagon. So in the case of both anthrax and COVID-19, once those events took hold, in those narratives took hold in the public consciousness, we have them being used to increase further gain-of-function research on these particular avenues in question. So in the case of the anthrax attacks, we have controversial programs that were defunded right before 9/11 involving anthrax being reinstated, with the anthrax attacks being used as justification. And in the case of COVID-19, a lot of the same risky gain-of-function research involving coronaviruses, is increased exponentially, supposedly as a way to develop new cures or vaccines for COVID-19. And there are lots of COVID-19 vaccine candidates being researched right now that don't really get a lot of coverage because of the ones that are already being used in the current and ongoing vaccination campaign. But, I wrote about last year, for example, there's actually even efforts to use gain of function research to combine the novel coronavirus at the center of the COVID-19 crisis with anthrax itself, supposedly to develop some sort of vaccine. But this type of research is being justified about as a way to develop vaccines or therapeutics, but really has the potential to create something much worse than what we've seen over the past year and a half. One of the most important parallels that exists between COVID-19 and anthrax attacks is actually that both events have served to rescue very troubled vaccine companies that had deep ties specifically to the US military. So I already talked about Bioport, now known as Emergent Biosolutions. If you want more information, you can read part 2 of my Engineering Contagions series. The Pentagon was going to release a report about how to continue their anthrax vaccination program that was first announced in 1997, how they were going to continue to do that without Bioport. Of course, because of the events of 9/11, that report never comes out because it was being prepared in the very part of the Pentagon that was hit on the day of that attack. And so with the anthrax attacks that follow shortly thereafter, you have all of the concerns about Bioport's anthrax vaccine and safety concerns about their factory mismanagement and a slew of other problems, completely replaced with a fervent demand for more of their vaccine. And now instead of mandatory vaccinations for the military with the anthrax vaccine, Bioport and also individuals in the military begin lobbying for mandated anthrax vaccine for postal workers, for first responders, for police officers, and so on. And those didn't quite take off, but it definitely did create a windfall of profit because of the stockpiling system set up again by largely by Robert Cadlick. So in the interest of time, I want to spend most of the section on this talk talking about how what specific vaccine company has been rescued by the COVID-19 event. And interestingly enough, the same company, Moderna, has ties to the US military as well, as its mRNA vaccine platform has been received initially most of its funding from DARPA, which is part of the US military. So as you can see here in 2017, this is from Stat News, a very mainstream media website. But here it's openly talking about how lavishly funded Moderna has hit numerous safety problems in their bold bid to revolutionize medicine. Moderna is in need of a Hail Mary to rescue its business, not unlike Emergent Biosolutions. With some of their previous products, it says the safe dose was too weak. Repeat injections of a dose strong enough to be effective had troubling side effects on the liver in animal studies and were unable to advance because of safety concerns. Moderna's head of vaccine quits after a pivot to vaccines. Even Stefan Bancel, who is the head of Moderna, even now today, but at this time as well, acknowledged that the delivery method used in Moderna's initial vaccines was not very good. And of course, with COVID-19 and the concerns for a vaccine and a quick vaccine, not unlike what happened with Emergent Biosolutions, a lot of these past safety concerns that were being openly discussed in the mainstream press have since disappeared. No discussion about, despite Moderna's track record with their and the issues, the safety issues they ran into and the toxicity issues they ran into. With some of their past products, all of that essentially evaporated. And of course, I'm sure people watching this are probably familiar with the ways animal trials were conducted, and that a lot of these studies that claim to show efficacy and safety are produced specifically by the same company, including Moderna in the case of Moderna's vaccine, and Pfizer in the Pfizer vaccine, the same companies that produce the vaccine itself. So the last parallel I'm going to be discussing today is the fact that both anthrax and COVID-19, as their proposed solutions, have involved major efforts to introduce a wide-ranging system of biosurveillance that has very little to do with public health, but a lot to do with advancing long-standing surveillance agendas of the U.S. national security state, as well as those in other countries. So in the case of anthrax, before the anthrax attacks even took place, or rather in the year and months preceding the anthrax attacks, you have the development by the US government of something called BASIS, Biological Aerosol Sensory and Information Systems. This was meant to detect anthrax and the related botulinum toxin via sensor, but this system instead showed that it was highly prone to generating false positives and was worthless beyond the ability to, quote, induce the very panic and social disruption it is intended to thwart. Despite that being the case, the Bush administration had this installed at the White House and I think in up to 30 cities throughout the United States. Despite it being essentially useless. Another one was called the Bio-Event Advanced Leading Indicator Recognition Technology, or BioAlert, and this was funded by DARPA, along with Johns Hopkins, UPMC, both of which had bioterrorism think tanks run by Tara O'Toole of Dark Winter fame, who I mentioned earlier, as well as IBM and General Dynamics. BioAlert intended to enable public health authorities to detect the potential terrorist release of a pathogen or toxin at the earliest possible moment, and has a lot of similarities to what was proposed after anthrax through the DARPA's Total Information Awareness Program, specifically its biosurveillance sub-program. So the biosurveillance program at TIA, or the Total Information Awareness Office, was aimed at developing the necessary information technologies and a resulting prototype capable of detecting the covert release of a biological pathogen automatically and significantly earlier than traditional approaches, and aim to do this by basically monitoring data sources, including people's medical records, behavioral indicators from, their, I guess, what would become their online activity and things like that. So with COVID-19, you have aspects of that TIA DARPA biosurveillance program become resurrected, and some of them have actually now been implemented, including HHS's AI-powered wastewater surveillance program that aims to detect COVID-19 before an outbreak emerges above ground. As if you've been following my reporting over the past year and a half, you will know that much of TIA survives today as the company known as Palantir, and it's no coincidence that Palantir is not only managing major aspects of that particular HHS program, but also all of the COVID-19 data for the US's HHS as well as the UK's NHS. Well, this has been a brief talk. Hopefully it's helped to shed some light on how the 2001 anthrax attacks and COVID-19 share some concerning yet important parallels. And this is particularly true in the case of the last parallel I discussed regarding biosurveillance solutions. It's quite clear from my research, especially over the past year and a half, that total surveillance was one of the main goals of the national security state in the wake of both 9/11 and the anthrax attacks. And while 9/11 and the war on terror sought to normalize and also institutionalize invasive surveillance of the physical world, the anthrax attacks and now COVID-19 have sought to do the same with the surveillance of the internal world that is inside our very bodies. And as I pointed out in several pieces over the past year, the admitted goal by the architects of these internal surveillance efforts is to have surveillance devices worn on or placed within the human body, at which point they say the road to these so-called digital dictatorships will be complete and also irreversible. 9/11 and the anthrax attacks were the initial catalyst that put us squarely on the road to this digital dictatorship future that these individuals wish to create. And now COVID-19 is being used as the catalyst for the last phase of the sinister project. Only by dealing honestly with the true nature of the events of 2001 can we begin to unravel the true nature of the events of the past year and a half and what we can expect in the not so distant future. We no longer have 20 more years to wait, and it is incumbent upon all of us, particularly those of us working within media, to vocally denounce the multi-decade project to rob the entire global population of its freedom and its future. And we must honestly grapple with the true nature of the events that took place in 2001 that have shaped our world in such considerable and significant ways. Thank you.